In this second presentation, we're going to be covering a variety of other topics that are discussed in Chapter 4, starting with privacy. The human-made structures we've been talking about so far are all designed to bring people together, but we all need time apart as well. This desire for privacy is a universal human need. However, it varies from culture to culture in terms of how that privacy is achieved. And we have different kinds of privacy. You have solitude, reserve, isolation, which all refer to being by yourself, either because you don't want to be with people, or you find yourself in a situation where you have to be alone. But you also have the concept of intimacy, which is also a kind of shared privacy with family or with friends. And then you have anonymity, which is an important concept in the modern world, where you might be surrounded by other people, but you find means to be anonymous and to achieve a certain degree of privacy. And we're going to look at how that works out in an office environment with a short clip from the film Office Space. So what we're seeing here in this movie is the modern American office work environment as it's sometimes structured, often structured in some industries, and it's not certainly unique to the United States, but it's an environment where you have very little physical privacy and where individuals find different ways to achieve virtual privacy or psychological privacy. And you see examples of, in the clip that we saw, the reference to Sandra, who is oblivious to co-workers and just finds her own way to work in isolation. You have Milton, who has his music playing on the radio and kind of create his own private little sphere there in which he feels comfortable. And then you have Peter, the main character in the film, who in the office has absolutely no privacy. People come and go, and it's obviously a high stress situation. And obviously what happens in this kind of environment where there's no privacy or no possibility of privacy is it's can be a very high load, high information load environment and cause a lot of stress. Privacy in the United States is an interesting topic. There's this notion that the U.S. is a voyeur nation, that we get off on peeking in on the lives of other people, and certainly if you look at American TV these days, you get a glut of reality TV shows, but keep in mind that these didn't always originate in the United States. Big Brother, which is probably the oldest reality show, actually originated in the Netherlands. In the U.S. also, and not only in the U.S., but in the U.S. we have this issue of privacy online, and there's always a lot of concerns with Facebook and Google, and not just in the United States. There's even more concern in particular other countries. Germany, for example, it's always a problem when Google goes through towns with their car to update their maps. It's always a source of concern for privacy in Germany and other countries as well. Then in the United States we have this issue with privacy in education. For example, in colleges and universities, they have to adhere strictly to a federal law called FERPA, and for the life of me I can't remember what FERPA stands for, but basically it guarantees privacy rights for students. And as a result of FERPA, if your parents were to call me up and say, "How is Johnny doing in your class?" I can't tell them anything. Though there's a high degree of privacy, this is something I think that sometimes parents, families are amazed at, but it's also something that's different from country to country. So we're going to look at, very briefly, at variations on privacy in different cultures. In China, we have this idea that the unit of privacy is not the individual but the family. And historically, in China, there was very little privacy for virtually all families. In fact, if it's really interesting if you're ever in China and go to Beijing to go through the Forbidden City or Forbidden Palace, which was where the emperor's family lived. It's a huge, huge structure, and it was designed for one family, and obviously there were a lot of servants and hangers-on, but they typically lived outside the Forbidden City, and you just walk from structure to structure. It's not just one building. There are multiple buildings there, and there are multiple gardens. And you think about the privacy that was enjoyed there, while there was absolutely no privacy for everybody else in China. And the interesting aspect of privacy in China is, as well, is the sense that, and this is not unique to China, that in a collectivistic culture, privacy is something that's a kind of an individual luxury, and particularly before the economic change in the 80s, privacy was viewed kind of as an unpatriotic thing. Effect of one-child policy is discussed a little bit in the text. The fact that traditionally there was no private space for children, that's certainly changed significantly now with these small families in China. You have the example of a couple of cultures in Indonesia that are discussed in the text. One in kind of community in Java where you have virtually no privacy, where you have to kind of achieve the kind of psychological privacy we were talking about in the cubicle environment in an office space. Bali in Indonesia is a culture that's very concerned with achieving privacy physically through building walls all around the family compound. Then you have different ways to achieve privacy. For example, in indigenous tribes in Brazil that send folks away from the community. I think some parents would probably appreciate this idea of sending adolescents away for a few years, and both the parents and the adolescents getting privacy in that way. And then you have the example of North Africa, where, for example, in traditional Muslim communities, you achieve privacy through your clothing. I'm going to mention a couple of other cultures, and I'm going to contrast, in fact, Brazil and Germany, very different kinds of cultures. We talked about indigenous cultures in Brazil. Here I'm talking about mainstream culture. And this is information that I've taken from the Intercultural blog by John Baldwin, who's a professor of communication in Illinois. And he talks about when he lived in in Brazil, and it was very warm. And it's interesting stories that he tells about his experience in Brazil in relation to both privacy and housing and kind of cultural practices. He mentions the fact that when you go to somebody's house, because it's so warm, the first thing they do before they even offer you a drink is ask you if you want to take a shower. And you take a shower, go in and take a shower and put your same clothes back on, and mentions the fact that at one time he went to a shower which was in a shed between two houses, and noticed that a wood plank was missing, and went back and commented on it that there was no privacy, and was told, well, what's the big deal about that? That's not considered a problem at all in Brazil. If you go to any beaches Brazilian beaches and Rio and other places, you'll see that in fact nudity is not considered in the same way that it is in the United States. He also talks about the fact that sharing is viewed quite differently in terms of your possessions, the fact that things are more freely shared. There's not as much a sense of this is mine and don't touch it. Just might just tell very briefly a story along those lines. I took a group of VCU students to Austria a few years ago, and we had one problem. These were students who were mostly living with host families. And we had one problem with one group of American students. These were three guys who were living in a large room together. And eventually we had to move them out. And the main problem was that the housekeeper, and actually there was the owner of the house, came in and cleaned and moved their stuff around. And they were so upset, even though they told her, don't do that, they were so upset that their private stuff was moved around that I had to find different accommodations for them. Well, certainly in Brazil, there's a very different attitude. Interesting also about where people sleep in the hot weather and the popularity of hammocks. Well, let's talk about a very different environment in Germany. Have lived in Germany for I guess a total of 4 or 5 years, and very different attitudes towards privacy than in Brazil, or for that matter in the United States. One of the things that you'll see kind of universally on German houses is these shutters, these so-called Rolladen shutters that you see on the picture on the left. The Germans want everything to be tightly closed up, and doors need to be always closed. In an office environment, if you have your door open, that's a signal that you're not doing any serious work. Let me just recite here another anecdote from my experience. My family and I did an exchange a number of years ago with a family in Germany. And so the German professor came over here and taught at VCU, and I went over and taught in Karlsruhe in Germany at the university there. And when the couple came to our house, they were upset about a couple of things. One is that the doors were not secure enough, including the screen door, the door to the screened-in porch. They wanted that to be more secure, even though it'd be very easy to just break through the screen. But then the wife was particularly upset that the doors inside also seemed very flimsy, and particularly the fact that their bedroom doors had no locks on them. I'm not sure why you'd want to lock in a house the interior doors in that way. This was just a couple. They didn't have any children. Just brought a dog over. But it just shows you the different attitude towards privacy there. One of the other things that you find in Germany is if in private homes, whenever possible, Germans will have a small garden or small backyard or front yard, and inevitably it will be surrounded by either a fence or a hedge, usually a hedge, that's preferred, and it will be very well maintained. German houses are very clean and well maintained. Everything has its place. But they very highly value their privacy in Germany. We're going to talk briefly about time orientation and two different kind of cultural takes on time. I think in the West we think that everybody has the same kind of attitude towards time, and everybody should be on time like we like to be in the United States. But that's a cultural thing, and the United States is typical of a monochronic orientation, where we have schedules and we want those schedules to be maintained. We do things one after another. You have to take turns. You don't do things all at once. And this is typical of low context cultures. But there's a very different orientation towards time in other cultures, a so-called polychronic orientation, where schedules are not important. And if you're working on some task that needs to get done, if you're interrupted, it may not be a big deal. They deal with that in a different way than we would in the United States. And it's not unusual to have multiple things going on at the same time. So in an office environment, for example, you might have people coming in interrupting all the time. A kind of extreme monochronic orientation is Germany. And that kind of behavior would be very much frowned on in a German office. Things need to be done one at a time in an orderly fashion, and not they're not very tolerant of interruptions or people coming in and interrupting and talking about other matters when there's a work to be done, a certain task to be completed. Here's a kind of sliding scale in terms of time orientation. I would put actually Germany at the top of the list, but the Germanic countries, they're in the Anglo countries, are typically monochronic, whereas polychronic or Latin American countries, Mexico, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, African countries, and kind of countries that are in, you see the countries that are in the middle, Central European countries like France, or you also have Spain represented there, that kind of are in between the monochronic and polychronic. The different orientations towards time can clearly cause some conflict. So if you have people from a monochronic culture who encounter people from a polychronic culture, or go to a country where that kind of attitude towards time is prevalent, the general perception is that these people are not getting anything done, that they're rude, that they are ignoring me because they're dealing with multiple people at the same time. And if in the other direction, the people in monochronic cultures are perceived as kind of cold and bureaucratic. It's interesting that this different time orientation has some influence on the organization of space in different cultures. So if you have a monochronic orientation, they tend to prefer small individual private space. So we're talking about Germany. That's the case certainly in the United States. That's the case as well. Universally, people who work in an office environment would prefer a private office to the cubicle environment that we saw in that film clip. And the expectation is that things happen in an orderly way, one at a time, and it's very clear how you get things done. There are rules that are set out and are followed. Polychronic orientation, instead of private space, there tend to be more communal space where a lot of things can happen at the same time. A lot of people can come together at the same time. There doesn't tend to be the same kinds of rigid rules that there would be for who comes next that you see in the United States and in other countries. And one of the things that one has to get used to in cultures that have this kind of orientation is to get things done. Sometimes you have to go kind of a circuitous route by kind of playing the bureaucracy through knowing the right people. They're not necessarily rules that are strictly followed.